Dancing Carl by Gary Polson. Chapter 1. In the summer in McKinley, Minnesota, when you are 12, there is so much to do that almost none of it gets done except fishing. It isn't that McKinley is big or busy. It's only got 1,200 people. Not much more than when my great-grandfather Marshall Knudsen homestead of the town site. I was named after him, and everybody calls me Marsh, except Willie, who is my best friend and always just says hey when he wants me. He also says there are only 900 people in the town of K.O. Morgan who owns a grocery. Says there are more to attract tourists. I have never figured out why having more people would bring tourists in, but I don't own a grocery either. So, there it is. But it's not a big town. And there is no real business either except some logging in the winter when the swamps are frozen enough to skid the big logs out of the woods. Also, there are a few farms, but they're small because of the dampness in the soil, which turns to mud in the spring during planting. The mud sticks the tractors so bad they have to use work teams of horses to pull them out, and what with running back and forth with horses to pull tractors out, you really couldn't call it farming. So you couldn't call McKinley a busy town either. But in the summer, for some reason, all the get-done things seem to come at you. The yard needs raking down and mowing with the push mower. Dad doesn't like the rotary mower because they rip rather than cut. The garden needs weeding all the time. The backyard fence needs mending and tightening because Willie Taylor's pony can't stand to stay out of new corn and leans on the wire. Trash needs to be burned and the front fence needs painting, or the rot takes the wood, and the flower beds need cleaning from the cats, and the storm window have come down, and the screens go up, or the mosquitoes carry you off, and it doesn't have to be a big town or a busy town to keep you jumping in the summer. And then right in the middle, to make it worse, Willie Taylor comes by and he's got his rod over his shoulder. And some night crawlers and angleworms in an old cottage cheese carton, and that pretty much takes care of fishing whatever chore you're doing. Finishing whatever chore you're doing. Willie has a way of talking so you think just ahead of what he's saying. He'll stop by the yard when I'm mowing the grass, and he'll stare down the street with his shoulders kind of over and down the way he has of standing, holding the rod in one hand and the worms in the other. Then he'll smile and say, "The grass won't grow much between now and dark." And what he really means is that the fish are biting while you can always mow and lawn the fish aren't always biting. Outside the town, there is an old iron and concrete bridge across the popular river. In the spring, it runs with suckers, which aren't much good for anything but fertilizer and pet food, although some folks smoke them and swear by them. But in the middle of the summer, the water in the polar settles down to tame, and the suckers head back to into the lakes, and the mud and the fishing on the bridge gets good if you're serious. Willie and I live there in the summer, or so it seems. Every afternoon we try to get down there, or almost every afternoon. Using a small hook and a piece of worm, you slide the hook down gently alongside the concrete pilings. right along the edge of the cement. That's where the big rock bass wait, and if you use a light line and a light leader, it can be fun catching them. They're scrappy, but it's even more fun eating them when they're battered in egg and cornmeal and fried just past moist in a hot pan the way my mother cooks them. Sometimes we sit in the sundown there all day. There's hardly any traffic on the bridge because it leads out to farms and farmers don't come into town that much. It can be pretty private, and when Willie gets to talking, it's fun to feel the sun. Just listen with one finger on the line, waiting for that raspy feeling. That means a rock bass is mouthing the bait, sucking it in and out the way they do before they take it. It was on a summer day like that with us down at the bridge fishing that the story of Carl started, even though Carl is all winter and ice, or part of the story anyway. It was hot and they weren't biting, but it didn't matter. The sun was keeping the mosquitoes down, and we had our shirts off getting tanned, and Willie snorted. You know, McKinley, isn't like other towns, considering that Willie was like me and neither of us had ever lived anywhere except McKinley. It hit me that Willie couldn't know that what other towns were like, but I kept my mouth shut. If you are to argue with Willie, you had to make sure you had some big guns. It wasn't that he was always right, though he usually was. It was that he read so much that even when he was wrong, he could throw in so much extra stuff that you felt lucky to get a word in. So I didn't say anything, but I thought it. I knew he'd go on anyway. It's the grown-ups, he continued. In McKinley, the grown-ups are different. Well, I couldn't let that one go by. How could you know that? And how are they different? Willie held up his hand for silence and started at his line as if he had a bite, but I knew he was just thinking, buying time. I read a lot, that's how I know, he said after a moment. In McKinley, people are kind of old-fashioned. Take your dad, for instance. My dad? Actually, my parents are probably the least old-fashioned people in McKinley. Dad, the least old-fashioned people in McKinley. Dad even talked about getting an Edison. My dad isn't old-fashioned. Sure he is. Doesn't he stick with that old push mower instead of changing over to a new rotary kind? Like I said, Willie always comes out on top. That's not so old-fashioned. Sure it is. And the rest of McKinley is like that. There are lots of people in town who still use the old push mowers. They rebuild them and keep them going, and they take care of their own families too. There was a jump, I thought, from push mowers to families. How does that make them old-fashioned? They don't let the state do it. Like everybody else in the country, they take care of their own. And from what I read, that's pretty old-fashioned. And I think he was going to say more about he got the rasp that bit a bite. Then, and when the bass took the hook, he set it and landed it, and the rest of the afternoon we spent fishing. But he was talking about McKinley being old-fashioned became parts of Carl's story, because Carl was one of those people in the town sort of took care of themselves rather than let the state do it. Or at least that's how it started. And went until it all turned around and Carl took care of the town. Or at least the rinks. The rinks. In the summer, everything just splashed out into warm days and warm nights and mosquitoes and some rain and sun and taking Willie's cousin's canoe down the popular camping until there isn't any summer left and nothing really to remember except a kind of warm feeling of fun and no real purpose. But in the winter, there are the rinks, only the rinks, and hockey and skating, and that is all, unless you count school, which is more or less just always there. But there isn't anything else to do in McKinley in the winter, and the rinks become a central place in town. In the winter, people who were off on summer vacation come back, and everybody meets at rinks, and everything that was loose and unorganized becomes tighter. Winter does that to everything in northern Minnesota, brings it in. But for the people in town, the rinks do more than just organize. They become the winter part of the town that means everything. The rinks are the town in the winter, even the grown-ups, and that's what made Carl so important. That's why when Carl came to the rinks and danced and fell in love with Helen and moved so only Helen and some of the kids could understand it first. That's why it affected the whole town. The rinks and everything in the winter, and that winter dance and Carl became everything at the rinks and taught us about living and being what we were and loving all mixed into cold and ice blue flat of the skating rinks. It was some of it a sad time and some of it a very happy time, and a lot more of it a hurting time. But most of all, like Willie Taylor said, when it was all over, the best time there ever was to be 12, moving towards 13.